Greetings, fellow world history colleagues, classmates, Mana U team. Answering the question about the differences between the Islamic Jihad and the Latin Christian Crusades. I found this to be a very interesting and difficult question. At first, I had to think about this for a while. One big difference seems to be that in Christendom, the idea of a crusade is a much later idea. Christianity is born in the first century, and we don't see the Crusades until 1095 A.D. That's nearly over 1,000 years after Christianity was started. Whereas in Islam, Muhammad, after becoming the leader of this new religion of his, immediately is going to war. He's involved in a ton of skirmishes. Historians say that prior to him becoming the leader of Islam, he lived a rather peaceful life, wasn't involved in a lot of conflicts. After becoming this so-called prophet, he immediately began to get involved in battles and skirmishes. And jihad, to strive for Islam, was ingrained into the very DNA, the very nature of Islam. It was baked in that you either had to be confessing your faith. I mean, that's the thing with the prayer being done 5 times a day. You're making a statement essentially in front of everyone, how you pray, where you pray. You have to confess your Islamic faith, and even go to war to fight for it. So that idea that everyone needs to know who you are and what you are in Islam, that idea is baked into the model, whereas in Latin Christendom, it doesn't come around until 1,000 years in, and it's not because it's mandated by God or mandated by Scripture. It's because at first it was a response to the Islamic advances, whereas for Islam, going forward and conquering Jerusalem and conquering, the idea for them was, to conquer the West. And whereas the West, the Crusades were initially instituted as a defensive measure, and in a way they kind of remain a defensive measure. So for the Crusaders, they could cry liberation, liberation, and the Muslims could cry for Islam, saving souls, because anyone who's not part of Islam is damned, is their kind of their binary philosophy. But probably the biggest difference there seems to be between the Jihad and the Crusades is the amount of unified order the Muslims had in their jihads. They were using mercenaries, trained soldiers, whereas the European armies would have success when they were unified, when they were led by soldiers, when they were led by a unified purpose. But as the recruiting methodology for this was very poor, the soldiers that they would get often were not very high caliber, were very disorganized. The leadership was frayed, and it wasn't as organized as it needed to be. That would be disastrous for them and ineffective. So whereas the Muslims seemed to run into the same problem with unity, it was as if they conquered some land, their leader would die, and they would disintegrate again because they would quarrel over power. Not really seeing the Europeans as the biggest threat in the world, but seeing them as the only enemy left to conquer. So for the Europeans, Islam was a threat, For the Muslims, Christianity was what was left to conquer. It was the only thing left to conquer. Islam was the predominant threat in the world at that time. The nations of Islam were the predominant threat, and Latin Christendom was their obstacle. So I think those are the biggest differences.